So as we briefly mentioned, we've been fortunate to be able to work with Dr. Robert Balfance and his team at the Everyone Graduates Center for a little over a year now, and even prior to that with getting set up for our high school redesign collaborative that offers an opportunity for some school districts in the state of Ohio to collaborate with other school districts across the nation to really learn about what it takes to redesign high schools. And as we were brainstorming what the next year looks like for our collaborative schools, we thought that this information and the evidence-based practices that really drive improvement in student outcomes could really be used when thinking about and setting up high-quality remote learning plans. So we pitched the idea to be able to offer the evidence-based strategies and the research behind them to a broader audience of school leaders across the state as we think toward restarting school for the 2020 school year. And Dr. Balfance and his team were all on board in sharing with you this information in this session today. So the majority of our time is going to be spent hearing from him and his team and some of the things that they've seen from the cross-state collaborative when it comes to high school redesign. I think you'll see that many of the evidence-based strategies that we're going to share with you today can even cut across different buildings across your school district. So we truly hope that this information is valuable as you look toward your remote learning plans and really putting students at the center of what the next school year will look like. A few logistical things. We will primarily use the chat function to interact today. So if you have a comment or a question, we will stop at the end of each segment to offer an opportunity for you to ask questions. You should feel empowered to go ahead and chat those throughout the session, though, if you'd like, and I'll be moderating the chat as we go along. So we definitely hope that this information that is shared with you today helps you feel empowered and even in these uncertain times, a little excited to think about how we might use this as an opportunity to learn from these redesigned schools. So if you're a school district that's in our collaborative and you're on our call today, we'd love for you to share your experiences as it is appropriate in our time together. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Balfance, and we thank you so much for being here today, and we're excited to hear more about your evidence-based strategies.
Great. Thank you, Cassie, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today and share a little bit about what we've been learning working with high schools in Ohio and other states on how we can use evidence-based strategies to create the supports students and teachers need to thrive. And we're going to then, for today, since we're all living under COVID, really talk about how what we were learning can be adapted to sort of remote learning environments. And as you heard, we're going to have 4 sections, and after each section, we're going to stop for some Q&A. But as your questions that come, please put them in the chat along the way. We'll begin with just some very brief introductory setup, and then we're going to get into 4 areas where the schools can control to really help their students and teachers thrive, whether it's remotely or in person. All right, so next slide, please. So as you heard a little bit, we've been working with Ohio and 5 other states on this idea of how can we design our high schools to work in the 21st century so that they really work for students and teachers, enable everybody to thrive. And if you go to the next slide, how we've been doing that is this idea of having an evidence base, building from what we know works, but then customizing it to local circumstances. So we know that a one-size-fits-all strategy doesn't work, but we also know that we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we want to build on what we know works and then tailor it to our communities. We also believe strongly that there should be local voice and community vision on what we're trying to do, and that we need to have very inclusive design teams that include teachers and counselors and leaders and students and community members. And you can sort of see how this has strong parallels to our COVID moment and how to really, there is no playbook for COVID. There is no set of strategies we know that work. We have to figure it out as we go, and we need lots of input. So we think that what we're learning on how to do that also helps inform how we can approach COVID, and therefore a lot of what we learned has a lot of transferability. If we go to the next slide. One of the key things that we've done and we're going to follow today is to really divide what we know about what works into 4 areas that are sort of under the control of schools that you can have at least strong influence on. And that's how you organize your adults. It's how you support your students. It's how you do teaching and learning, and how you provide sort of equitable post-secondary pathways and experiences for all students. And what we've done, and we go to the next slide as an example, is in each of these areas, we've sort of given the bumper sticker of the key idea of what it is. So for organizing adults, it's really about its teams, not individuals, right? We have to build teams of adults working together to meet the challenges we have. We've identified some key mindset shifts that need to happen so that our efforts stay in place, because if we just change practices but not mindsets, those practices often don't last. We've identified key evidence-based practices like teacher teams, distributive leadership, for example, and supporting structures. And I'm not going to go into this in any detail now. I just want to, we'll go to the next few slides just to show you. This is just sort of show you the foundations of what we're saying today, to show where it's coming from. So for teaching and learning, it's about supported and engaged and challenged classrooms. If we go supporting students at the center, it's really about building hope, agency, trust, and relationships. And for post-secondary pathways, it's this idea that, you know, many of our high schools that we're in were designed for a different era, when high school was the endpoint of schooling for most students. Now it's the stepping stone, right? Everyone has got to go from high school to somewhere to be able to have an occupation that supports their families. So that causes a lot of rethinking and a lot of ways that we have to sort of create new ways to do that, to make sure that all students get what they need. And that's never been more true than now, right? When we have to do that in the midst of a big sort of global pandemic crisis. All right, the very last setup we want to have before we dive into it is just to remind ourselves on the next slide, is just the context of what we're doing this work under COVID. I think a good reminder is just to do a reflection on our spring, which we know was a very chaotic and unpredicted time, and everyone did amazing work, but we're just, sort of, figuring out as we went. But it's important to reflect a little bit of like where that left our kids. And so an organization called America's Promise Alliance was started by Colin Powell a while ago, did a big survey of about 3,000 13 to 19-year-olds across the country and asked them their sort of spring experiences. It found that almost all participated in some form of remote learning, but 3/4 said they were spending 4 hours a day or less on their classwork, right? So considerably smaller amount of time than normal. 40% said they had been offered no social emotional support from an adult from the school. So sort of like they were not able to, those key school connections that happen face to face, understandably, many schools weren't able to quickly reproduce in a virtual environment, but that's something we know we have to do better on. And because of this, almost 1/4 of them felt disconnected from schools, adults, and their classmates, right? That's a big challenge for us, right? When 1/4 of our kids are saying their spring experience was one of disconnection, how, as we keep being remote in the coming fall, do we overcome that, right? And if we go to the next slide, we also have to remind ourselves, and we know this because we're living through it, but it's good, is that, they're feeling a lot of stress and pressure. They're sleeping less. They're more worried about the health of their family. They're more worried about finances, right? Because we know it's a medical crisis, but there's an economic crisis with it. So the bottom line to remind ourselves is that nearly all young adolescents are telling us, 13 to 18-year-olds, that in the spring they spent less time in learning than normal, and they were under more stress and pressure, right? And so that's sort of the foundation of which they approach us as we reconnect with them in the fall. Next slide. It's also, another amazing fact is both how much parents were asked to do and how much they were able to do. So the census actually asked people in May, how much time are you spending helping your kids with learning? And very interestingly, they found that high income and low income parents, it was about the same. It was about 13 hours they were spending per week helping their children learn, right? Which is an enormous increase, right, from the norm. So that's another part of the puzzle to keep in our mind. Next slide. And again, we won't go into this in long, but just to remind ourselves that there's many negative impacts of COVID that our students, and it will vary, right? Some of themselves personally will have gotten ill, or family members will have gotten ill or tragically passed away. Others are under great, economic stress or food insecurity. Many have a sense of fear of the unknown and the uncontrollable. Some are going to be very frustrated by their sort of interrupted schooling. On the plus side, we go to the next slide. We also remember for some of our students, there may have been some positive impacts. Many students became sort of first responders. They helped deliver groceries. They helped things keep happening. They earned money for their families. And for many kids, they may have felt a lot of agency from this, right? That they were actually doing something positive for others and making a real difference. Some may have experienced that distance learning worked better for them than being in school. Particular kids who were sort of being bullied and teased, right? It may have been a great relief to have that gone away and still be able to learn. So this is to keep in mind is that as we bring our kids back, everyone experienced COVID, but everybody experienced it in a different way. And we really can't guess. We really have to talk to them and find out and know there's going to be both pluses and minuses and a history of their experience in the spring that we have to recognize. All right. With that, what have we been learning from our work that can really help inform remote learning plans? So let's dig in to our first group question, which is, what do we know about how organizing adults can help schools support remote learning plans? And the idea here is that the adults in our building are the school's biggest and best asset. And how you organize them can really impact what your students experience and how as a group, collectively, they're able to sort of deal with this environment of great uncertainty and great unpredictability, and having a shift from this to that. So let's dig into a bit about what we've learned that might really apply to sort of organizing our adults to support remote learning. So basically, there's a number of teams that have got to be expanded or slightly retrofitted or adapted. So many schools have distributive leadership structures and professional learning communities. And what we've learned is we've got to really lean into those and really expand them in many cases. So one of the things that folks have learned is that some of the schools that were able to be most react the quickest in the spring were those that leaned heavily into sort of this idea of distributed responsibilities, adaptive cultures, and really stressing building strong relationships between teachers and students and teachers, sort of really relationship-driven schools. We're able to be more adaptive than those that were largely driven around impersonal structures and procedures. And so that really tells us we have to lean into this idea of distributive leadership and space for adult learning and collective effort. Next slide. We're going to have to, as we said, understand where our students are. And we're going to basically have to create a data collection team, right? There's a number, and throughout this presentation, we've listed links to sort of tools you can use, and they will show up in red. So we have to ask our students what their experience were, both with learning in the spring and current home circumstances. And we have to do it a couple times in the year because COVID keeps changing. Fortunately, a number of organizations have developed free tailored surveys to COVID-19 and even to remote schooling under COVID-19. So we list two there, and it's important to sort of build a team that can sort of conduct this data and hear from our kids where they are. Next slide. And then this team, but I would really argue maybe another team, because we're really trying to distribute responsibility and not overwhelm anyone with too much to do at once, is then got to analyze that data, right? And see what the key indicators are, figure out what to share broadly with the school community, and really then think about what are the few strategic places where some additional action will have the biggest impact. Next slide. And this perhaps, our learnings are the clearest, is really the most challenging, but the most necessary, which is that it's pretty clear that a large number of kids are going to, especially when they've gone from virtual in the spring to continual virtual in the fall and not having a chance to step into school to reconnect before they go virtual again, going virtual to virtual. In that environment, we're going to really have to create structures where for many kids, there is an adult point of contact that can be their navigator and their supporter, right? And build a supportive relationship with them and get to know them and their family as people and be able to give them accurate information, right? Because the schedules keep changing and it's a very different environment of what's happening when. And then also, not that they have to be able to answer this, but when needs arise, to know to be able where to direct them. And again, there's some good tools that are available for folks who have done that. And one thing that is a very useful tool is this idea of relationship mapping. It's a pretty quick exercise just to establish which adults have existing relationships with which students. And it might be not predicted. Maybe it's not the teacher they had in a class, but it's a teacher that ran a club they were in, to basically figure out who has existing relationships to build upon. And then there's also some good tools to sort of build some online structures to sort of make sure kids have these advisors. This is going to be challenging, but think about that statistic, right? That said 25% of 13 to 19-year-olds said they were disconnected in the spring. We know from all our work on dropout prevention that if you don't reconnect with those kids that were disconnected, we're going to lose them. And the only way to really connect is at a personal, direct, one-to-one relationship that's based on knowing and caring about each other as people. Next slide. And to follow up on that, and sort of the last team, is that we really have to have a strategy for those kids that were disconnected, right? And we're not participating on a regular schedule in the spring. And again, this is particular for places that are going from virtual to virtual with no ability to bring the kids back to school to reconnect. We're going to have to figure out a way to find those kids. And one thing that we've heard too is that we might not think of is that some of these kids feel like they might get in trouble because they didn't participate in the spring, right? They feel like they might get in trouble for having sort of dropped off the map. And that's a reason to avoid reconnecting. And we really have to assure them that no, they're welcome, we understand, we're here to help you, we're not going to blame you, you're not going to get in trouble. We really want to find a way to make it work. And we know you may have a lot of family responsibilities or caregiver responsibilities, and we really want to solve that. And you need a dedicated strategy to make that happen. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to end this section, Organizing Adults. So it's a cue to start getting your questions queued up. By giving an example from a living, breathing school that's been thinking about this. And this school is a school that really has done a lot of research into brain science or learning science, and use that as sort of a foundational premise for how to organize their remote learning. And some of the key lessons they learned was that first they started out with 65-minute periods, which was their norm. And in surveying, right, asking their teachers and students, as we said is important to do, they were universally told that was too long. So they worked to balance, the amount of time spent in sort of direct instruction with time spent in sort of creating advisory or one-to-one or small group dialogue time. And they also tried to, reduce screen time overall and build up some independent work that was of quality, not quantity, to go along with the screen time. They built more breaks in, right? We don't think in the virtual world we need those breaks because we don't have to walk from classroom to classroom. But all of us, I think, have learned we certainly do need mental breaks from that video interaction. And so those are important to build in. And then if we go to the next slide. They also recognized they had to sort of pare down what they were doing and ask themselves, what's going to matter 2 years from now? Let's focus on that. They also, really from the learning science, learned about giving sort of more regular doses of targeted feedback and a lot of more low stakes assessments to get that feedback. A number of things kids have said about the spring was one of the most frustrating things was when they couldn't ask anybody if they didn't understand something. That was like hard for them to figure out how to do. They used to be able to ask a peer or a teacher or stay after class. So we have to think through how to do that. And sometimes these shorter, smaller doses of feedback is a way to get at that. They also learned that projects were really important, but they weren't the best way to transfer new content. They were really better at helping students apply that content. And they also learned that you sort of have to constantly iterate and constantly get feedback. And so after they made all these changes, all based on feedback, the next feedback they got was, well, that was pretty good. You got all the school stuff right, but all the fun stuff is gone. right? And so now they're trying to think about how to incorporate that back in. So I just wanted to give that as a living, breathing example of how a school was thinking through how to sort of organize adults by getting a lot of feedback from their students and their teachers, and sort of using learning science as a guide in this way to keep iterating, because again, we're all working without a map. All right, so with that, I believe, next slide. We actually have some resources from the state and others, and I'm going to let them take a minute just to speak on that, and then we're going to get to Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Bob. So with the Ohio, there's some feedback. Right, so with the Ohio resources, I was very intentional to find not just resources that are highlighted in our current reset and restart documents that have been released, but also highlight some pieces that are found from the department from prior to the COVID-19 pandemic happening. So in relation to the previous slides that we have just discussed, the real focus here on how do we support the kids in their social emotional learning and the parents and the caregivers. So here we have a couple of resources just highlighting, all right, family engagement. How do we get our families involved in this new world of virtual learning and maintain those relationships that are critical to the student's success? And within that, I really wanted to highlight the Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center. They're out of the Ohio State University, and their big task or their goal is to take these evidence-based practices and really put some traction to it and make sure that we actually apply it within our districts. And then the reset, restart, returning to school, that support of that social emotional piece, they've really taken a deep dive of what are all of the different facets of things that students may need within, and then linking to our social emotional learning standards from prior to all of this happening. It's been a big shift at the department to focus on the social emotional learning of the kid and make sure we're addressing the whole child. And then also the CASEL work behind the social emotional learning and their roadmap to reopening school. They've done a lot of great work to kind of map out what does this possibly look like. And this is not all of the resources. This is just a sampling of what the department has and tied directly to this segment of the presentation. All right, that's it. I'll turn it back over to you, Bob.
Sure. And so this is the point. If folks have had any questions, please use the chat function. Ask your questions in chat, and we'll take a few of them if you have them yet, or if not, we'll come back. But let's take a moment and see if there's any questions in chat that folks want to talk about for how we can organize adults to support remote learning.
Kimberly, it might be helpful to go to, I believe it's slide 5, that introduces the evidence-based practices underneath the organizing adults lever. The idea of using teacher teams, interdisciplinary teams, and considering how those might play out in a remote learning plan could be interesting for our school leaders. It looks like we do have a question. With so much data available, which data would you recommend just starting with?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think it's on two levels. I do think we have to get a broad sense of like where our kids are walking in the door after what they've been through. So some sort of one of those surveys about just what their current state is, what their current emotional health is, what their current engagement with schooling in the spring is. It's important to understand that baseline. Then another thing I found is important is there's this idea of school connectedness, and I think that's very important right now, and especially in a remote learning environment. And that's really based on asking, does a student have an adult who knows them and cares about them as a person? Is the student able to connect with peers, even if remotely, so they have peer support? Are they engaged, interestingly enough, in a pro-social activity, like helping others? That's been found to be strong for connection. And do they find school to be a welcoming place? I think that's another key set of data points to again, really let us know where we're beginning from, so we can really tailor the supports we need to keep making sure students are sort of have a sense of belonging, that we build their resilience, that they feel engaged.
And that looks like our only question under organizing adults.
All right, it takes a while to absorb this, I know, and think about it. So let's move on to teaching and learning. All right, so what have we learned, or what do we know about teaching and learning to really inform remote learning plans? Well, interestingly enough, across the pond, as they say, that there's a group in England that's done a lot of work on building evidence-based understanding, and they've done a rapid assessment on what makes remote learning more effective. And of course, the fundamental is you got to have access to an instruction on how to use the technology, right? If you don't have the device, if you don't have internet, we're not going to make much progress. And also, importantly, that you understand how to use it, right? And we can't assume that's universally known. But once that's done, what they found is what matters is how students are taught more than the techniques, right? So the time-tested things we know matter of clear explanations, scaffolding, and feedback turn out to be more important than whether it's live or it's taped or it's a big group or it's a small group. So while those different modalities of techniques matter for just reaching kids, it's important to remember that it's really these fundamentals of explanation, scaffolding, and feedback which really distinguish more or less effective instruction online. They also found, again, that peer interaction is pretty important for motivation, and that we need to think about how to have that happen remotely, how to still able to have peer feedback, or have live group or partner discussions, right? And not have it just be a didactic thing between the teacher and the students, which at some level is hard enough remotely. But again, to remind ourselves that peer interaction is often the motivator to keep kids engaged. They also found it was important to really model and help kids think independently and learn independently. If you think about this, right, we spend in high school, we have an arc from like 9th graders to 12th graders, and we certainly expect and hope our 12th graders to be quite independent learners. But we often have found that for our 9th graders, we have to have some structure. We still have to build structures in. We still have to help them make that transition to be independent learners. And under COVID, for our incoming 9th graders, we're not going to have that. They're going to be sort of thrown right in and asked to be more independent learners. So again, it's a reminder that we have to build in some support and experience and instructions on how to do that. Next slide. And then just a few things we've learned, really, these have really come directly from our cross-state high schools in Ohio and elsewhere, when we asked them to reflect on what worked in the spring. And what we heard is this, one of the key things is when you can provide videos of key lessons, right, that let students watch them multiple times or on their own schedule. That was effective. Using student choice and voice and helping others, again, to build this motivation, echoing what they found in England. One of my favorite lines that came from a school was this idea of how to combine high expectations with grace and empathy, right? This idea that we still have high expectations that our students, even despite all the challenges, can engage in quality work, but we also have to have some grace and empathy about how and when that is done, right? So be tighter and still stronger on what we expect the outcome to be, but to be looser and more empathetic and graceful about how we get there, right? Sometimes we're pretty tight on that too, and they really found you don't want to give up on the expectations, but you got to blend it with that grace and the empathy. And that really fits into this idea of finding multiple ways to demonstrate competency. The more we can create multiple paths to showing I'm doing quality work under the sort of extreme conditions that we're all having to operate, the better result our schools are finding. All right, next slide. Another thing, and this I was when we asked that what should we measure question before, and when we were having our Q&A, I held off on this part of it because I knew it was coming. I would say, obviously, in addition to the challenges kids are facing and where their sense of connection is, we do have to have an understanding of where they are, right, in their learning progressions. But the warning here is that if we don't think about how we do this diagnostic testing, and we get a little bit too hung up in terms like learning loss, right, we could get it wrong. It's pretty easy to get an inaccurate result. And some of the things we know is that before we do that, we have to reestablish the human connection and the relationship. We have to understand the stress kids are under, and we have to reactivate their prior knowledge, because we use words like loss and melt, but really what learning science tells us is that knowledge is not loss. It's just harder to activate because it hasn't been used recently. So we really have to try to reactivate that a little bit before we figure out where we are. Because otherwise, again, we may overestimate where kids are, and that might lead to sort of some negative interpretations on the kids themselves, feeling like they're being judged, or again, they're behind or they're in trouble. And so we just have to really be right. We need to know this knowledge, but we've got to create the right environment to get accurate results. So this really speaks to what a number of schools are working on, is creating a couple-week period at the start of school where we're just sort of, it's about, we're all in this together. We're a team. It's hard, it's challenging, but if we work together, we can get through it. We're here to support you and not blame you, and reestablish those connections, reestablish some of that prior knowledge, and then do our diagnostic testing. Next slide. And what this speaks to, too, is this idea that really the best defense against learning loss might be a good offense. And the evidence for this actually comes from Hurricane Katrina. And, I knew this, but, it's been a while. And if you didn't live through it, you may not recall it. But under Hurricane Katrina, a large percentage of kids in New Orleans lost out on a year of schooling. They didn't even have remote schooling, right? They were in transit, they were displaced, the schools weren't opened yet. There was very little sort of formal education they were engaged in for over a year, right? So that's even perhaps more intense than what our kids are facing now. So of course there was a big push when they came back to recover from this. And what they found, especially at the high school level, is that those that took a more traditional remedial approach, well, you missed 9th grade, so we're going to do 9th grade, didn't do as well as those that sort of said, well, we have to figure where you should be, let's move forward, but let's backfill strategically when we get to that place where we need backfilling, did better. And to help us with this, the New Teacher Project has what's called a learning activation guide. It's there, really designed for COVID, which gives some very nice supports and structures and tools on how to sort of do this thoughtfully, how to both recognize where you have to fill in what some of the kids, because obviously in high school, right, there's parts of algebra you need to do geometry or vice versa, or you can't do algebra 2 before you've done some of algebra 1. Same thing with science. So again, you can't ignore it, but there's arguing in a more strategic way to approach it. It's not simply traditional, let's assume we have to start in the beginning, but really think about a way to do a mix of where we're both moving ahead and filling in where needed, and not assuming everyone needs to sort of go back and do again. Next slide. And the last thing in the teaching and learning area we found to support remote instruction is this idea of engaged learning, right? Which is important all the time, but it's going to be more important, as we saw in that data from the kids themselves in remote environments. Because it's pretty easy to disengage, right? Because you're still fundamentally learning alone. You're by yourself in your room. And in that situation, it's challenging and it's easy to get disengaged or not quite know where you are, what the purpose is. And because of that, we have to spend even more time thinking about how to make sure the instruction and the classroom environment is engaging. Fortunately, a lot of work has been done in this area recently, and it's come up with some pretty direct things that matter. Again, this idea of teacher caring, the feedback for growth we've heard about, and meaningful work, that the work I'm doing matters and is important. If we go to the next slide, this is another example of some very nice tools being out there that are very user-friendly, which is that this organization out of Stanford called PERTS, for these key elements of engagement, has developed very short surveys, 3 questions each. They can be done in 5 to 10 minutes, which means they can be done often. And what they recommend is to be done by teacher teams often, so they can, share ideas and results. The idea is you get a baseline, you try some things, see if it works. A month later, you can give it again and see if it did work. And if it did work, great, you can share it with others. If it didn't work, you could try something else. So it's a way to get very rapid feedback to the teachers and then having them think together what they can do to create engagement. And that's gonna really, that's a new frontier for all of us in a remote learning environment. So it's a very nice set of tools to get that feedback, because the only way we're going to learn is to try, gather data, and make adjustments. And what's nice about this is this has been designed to be very, very realistic for real classrooms, not some long 30, 40 minute thing, but 5 or 10 minutes. This means you can do it more often. Next slide. And really where we're going to end this section, so again, I'm queuing up, you're able to think about Q&A questions. It says high school grades and course credit, right? We know in the spring that, there was many places where you were when we left is sort of where you would, you were held harmless, right? And you could improve, but, where you were in March was sort of used in many places for your final grades. We know that's going to be different this year. We also know that grades are still the strongest predictors of both high school graduation and post-secondary success, and that getting decent grades in challenging classes is really the thing that drives a lot of long-term student success. So we really do have to think under COVID, right? How we can continue to have access to challenging work, whether it's in person or remote, and a means to demonstrate their skill and knowledge, but in a way that's recognizes that high expectations with grace and empathy, and also the conditions under which it's happening and the many responsibilities many of our kids have to help their younger siblings learn or to earn money to support the family. And this really gets back to, there are now, again, some good emerging models out there of how you can do sort of virtual portfolios and virtual project-based learning. And again, this idea of creating multiple ways to demonstrate competency in challenging work. And we give a link there, and if you follow that link to the website, there's some additional links of again, tools people have built to work in a virtual environment. But this is a challenge we've all got to face together. Again, there is no playbook, but it's one we have to think deeply about. Next slide. And this brings us back to our Ohio resources.
Yep, I'm back again. All right. So with Ohio, we have done a really good job with providing additional resources for teachers with this teaching and learning aspect of the high school redesign, those 4 pillars. We have student readiness kits. And within this presentation, which we will get to you momentarily, we're trying to figure out the link problems that have been going on. They've been really great to break it down into different subject areas. Now, not every content area has a toolkit, but every content area does have some kind of resource or a guide or a gap analysis provided for teachers to use as we kind of fill in from the spring and transition to the next school year. So you have those different toolkits. The Office of Career and Technical Education has done a really great job outlining what it looks like to reset and restart from their perspective. How do we get kids, because a huge aspect of that is that kids going out into the business and industries, how do we continue to provide that in some way, but still maintain the expectations that are necessary during the pandemic? There's also the Remote Learning Resource Guide that was released back in April. And there's still some great content in there that is applicable now in the fall. And the Office of Learning and Instructional Strategies have been really good to host virtual meetups and provide those content-specific resources. This link here will take you to that website where it has all of their different meetings, when they are, what they're going to cover, and they've been very intentional to also partner with the professional organizations within Ohio. So you see more than just the department's viewpoint, but also these professional organizations and what they can provide. And then also the link to the graduation flexibility, especially in the high school realm. There have been constant questions about how do we make sure that our kids are still on track to graduate, whether they're the class of 2021 or 2022. And this resource will kind of help provide some clarity on what that looks like for you all. Pass it back over to Bob. You're muted, Bob.
Thank you. So yes, we're now at our question and answer time for teaching and learning or organizing adults. If a question has come up since we last break, but anything coming to mind, any examples you want to share, any challenges you're facing, thoughts on how we approach teaching and learning remotely, and how we make this all work. What are we thinking?
Bob, there was a question that came in. Do you have a suggestion of where should be the balance between synchronous and asynchronous? If you want peer discussion on one hand, but want to honor individual schedules and home responsibilities, where's that balance?
That's a great question. And I think I think what people have found, one way to handle that is, even if it is live, I can't keep it right there, to have a taped version of it so people can watch it on their own time. And also the other approach to it is almost a version of the classic flipped classroom idea, where you make the content available asynchronous. Here is the core content we're going to cover, which could be a videotape, right? It could be a tape of presenting it. And then you schedule time to discuss it, to give you the face-to-face. And you could schedule several options, like there was a class discussion time here, or you could schedule peer discussion times there. So I think more than saying it's a or B, it is thinking through how you solve both those problems, how you both have a core set of knowledge that's accessible to folks at varying times, and how you create some time and space for them to connect and discuss it with other folks.
We may want to, one more time, go back to the general evidence-based practice slide. I believe it would be slide 6, just to give folks an understanding of the evidence-based practices that fall within this lever.
All right. I think, well, let's move on because there will be Q&A time at the end. And again, it just, the stuff that's a lot, and people probably need some time to.
We did just get one.
Okay.
To field it.
Okay, for sure. Absolutely.
Examples of ways to give students voice and choice in content areas with strictly defined curriculum and assessment. So what are some examples of ways to give students voice and choice in content areas with strictly defined curriculum and assessment?
Yeah, so I think in that case, what you're saying is the content has to be held tight and what they're going to be assessed on. Where you can give them some voice and choice is in the modalities in which they present their learning, right? So there can be a project-based way to address that content. There can be a more traditional, like, test or quiz way to do it. There could be situations where there are some established cooperative learning techniques where there's still individual responsibility can be figured out. So I think all I'm saying, I think choice and voice in that circumstances has to come in the how the work is done as opposed to like what the content is.
We have some resources also that might be helpful around integrating coursework, which is particularly useful for the middle and high school level. But thinking about how to allow students to, as Bob mentioned, choose the way in which they demonstrate their learning through whatever interests they may have, could also really be a way to empower students to choose what they're learning about. So if you're interested in how to maybe blend courses across curriculum to allow some more flexibility, we'd be happy to connect with you on that.
Great. All right. All right. So our last big one, let you know, because we're going to be our last one. This is our last big area. What do we know about supporting and putting students at the center during COVID and really in a remote setting? How do we keep our students connected and supporting when schooling is remote? Right, is the challenge we face. And I'm just to let Kimberly know, I'm gonna. There's a lot of here. I'm gonna like skip ahead in a few places, and I'll tell you where, just to keep it concise. All right, next slide. So as we mentioned a little bit, but it's important to keep reminding ourselves, is the impact of COVID on students really will depend both on the circumstances in which they experience COVID and how they internalize those experiences. And we know that two students can face similar circumstances, but experience and process them very differently, leading to different impacts. And there's a very nice resource on this, it's quite readable, about this idea of building resilience as a way to sort of help deal with that. But just for us to know that we can't just look at a kid and know what their COVID experience is, because it's both what they happened and how they interpret it, and it's going to vary a lot. So that's part of the challenge we face. Next slide. So this tells us then, right, we have to have some thoughtful restart activities that sort of are universal, right? And it's really about this idea of reconnecting, but also reframing COVID, right? Because again, many kids and families have experienced this as an individual story. But to create school community, we have to change that narrative and talk about how collectively and collaboratively and together we can help all of us get through this, right? And also to reframe it from sort of, this shocking, surprising, unpredictable, uncontrollable thing to something about how we can sort of like still find a way to move forward through it, right? So this idea of reframing, right, is a very powerful idea, and creating sort of a narrative for the school on how we as a school can move forward together. And this is really this idea of building this foundation of sort of trust and support, and in a sense that we're all in this together and we're all sort of one. Next slide. So some tools to use to help this is that a group called Turnaround for Children has put together a nice set of tools for maintaining relationships and routines, which are very important to build consistent routines, because it turns out that Our human minds love predictability, so that's why many of us are struggling in the current time. But that predictability and routines are important for what's called having a quiet mind, which means a mind that can focus on the task at hand, right? It's instead of just being, what's happening? What do I do? Where do I go now? Right? That too awake mind, right? Is hard to concentrate. So routines help with that. So those are very important to maintain, and also relationships. And there's some good tools you can find on how to do this that are referenced here. Next slide. So then the challenge we face is that we know we need to do these sort of universal strategies, but how do we know what kids need when and where, right? And so what that brings us to, on the next slide, is really, many schools have some version of early warning, on track, and MTSS student support systems. And there's some key ways that we can sort of adapt those to work under COVID, both remotely or face-to-face. And Kimberly, here's where we're going to jump ahead to the slide 3 or 4 down that says establish data and human systems. So you could just briefly flip through and I can tell you where to stop. There you go. So how we can adapt these existing systems, these MTSS or student support systems, is to know that first, the big difference under COVID is that everybody's experiencing it. And many of these processes were designed for a subset of kids who need them. So in many schools, it's a pretty small team that runs the MTSS or on track or early warning system. It could be a lone counselor, it could be a small team. And we're going to have to think how to expand that team and get more adults involved, because we have more kids. It's potentially all kids, right? That we sort of have to progress monitor, track, look for patterns, establish responses, see how those responses go. So that's the first thing we have to collect the data, but create the human system to interpret that data. And on top of it, it's not just the data, but it's also our human insights that matter, that really help us figure out what happens. So it's a system that combines the data, what we know about our kids, and provides a place that we can pool that data and work collectively to find strategies. And in many cases, that's just going to be about expanding and enlarging and adapting existing systems. Next slide. And then also, there's this, many of you have heard about, the idea of the ABCs as predictive indicators, attendance, behavior, course performance as being the core indicators of sort of being on track to high school graduation and post-secondary success. And what we have to think of under COVID, if we go to the next slide, and again, this is one that's better to, to ponder when you have the time, but I just want to highlight it for you, what's there. If we go to the next slide, is that, all these things are different remotely. Attendance is different when it's remote. Behavior is a difference when it's remote. Course performance is different when it's remote. And there's both things we want for all kids and some things we want for kids that need more help. So I'm not going to go into this in detail here, and I talked about many of its elements in the presentation. You'll see sort of those PERT student engagement measures there. You'll see school connectedness there that we talked about. The one thing I will mention about attendance, and I think Ohio is working on its own guidance for this, but remotely attendance has at least 2 parts. One, do students have the opportunity to learn? Do they in fact have devices? Do they have an internet connection? Are they then showing up on a regular basis for however, whether it be asynchronous or synchronous? Is there evidence that they are at least connected? That's the most basic level, right? Do they actually have the opportunity to learn? The second level, I would argue, is then are they able in those conditions to do the work? And it really is like, how many of their assignments are they getting in? Are they getting in almost all their assignments in all their classes? Are they getting in assignments in some classes and not others? Or in many classes, are they not getting in assignments? Some simple, easy trilogy like that that's more easy to check. And I would say, practically speaking, that's probably, those 2 things together become our virtual measure of attendance, right? Are you connected? And are you showing at least some evidence of presence? But it's pretty easy to show presence and not actually be there in a remote environment. So I think we have to add and are you then able to get the work in? Because in cases where kids are not showing presence or not able to get our work in, those are sort of our modern versions of chronic absenteeism in a remote world that says we need to figure out what's going on and what type of supports are needed. All right, next slide. And as I mentioned before, but it's good again, this idea of school connectedness. And what I like about this is these are easy things to track in a simple tracker, right? Do kids have an adult connection? Do they have a peer connection? Are they engaged in pro-social activities? Is school a welcoming place? And really with that, it's important to remember virtually, particularly for high school kids, maybe not the thing we do the first couple of weeks, but after that, we really have to think how we can get student activities continuing in a virtual format. You know, debate team, drama team, sports teams. That's the glue that holds many kids' level of engagement and participation in schooling. It's where those important peer connections are created and happen. And we have to think about how to sort of keep that going, since we're now sort of potentially in this virtual world for the longer term. It's not just maybe a couple week thing. It's really important to think about how to keep those school connections going. And there's a link here to a presentation we did about how to keep kids connected when schooling is remote, which goes into more detail about how to keep those student activities going. Next slide. And so now we're just going to go through a few slides pretty briefly on how we put all these pieces together, how we can really organize adequate resources to provide school-wide supports, progress monitor all students on sort of these adaptive ABC indicators, and be responsive and adaptive as needs evolve. So a key piece of that is this team we talked about, how we analyze this data, and this key idea that we really have to put down what we decide to do. I mean, this may seem obvious, but in the quote pre-COVID world, when everyone was already incredibly busy, in many of these support things, people didn't write down what they decide to do because they believe they'll remember it, but life is busy and then they don't, and then it's hard to know if it worked. Next slide. Really important to involve students as co-designers of this work, right? We have to talk to them and know them as people and understand where they're at. So we really have to think about ways to have them be co-designers of these student supports, have them help solve how we keep student activities going, help them help solve how we create ways for you to get your work done when you have heavy family responsibilities. Not as an individual doing it, but as a group of kids thinking about it. And this idea of really, focusing on well-being. All right, next slide. Again, like many folks use resource mapping, it's important to update this for COVID. It tells us what our responses are, and it's also important to have this widely shared. Again, in sort of pre-COVID, more traditional times, a lot of this knowledge is held by a few people, what resources the schools have, because people know I'll just refer them to these people and they'll figure it out. In the COVID environment, everyone is sort of a frontline worker, first responder, and they need to know when they hear about a big family need or a student need, what resources are available to who they can go to find out. So it's both updating them and sort of more widely disseminating them. Next slide. This is a daunting amount of work we're talking about, right? And a daunting amount of student need. So again, it's important to try to find ways to keep our community partners involved. And this is jumping ahead, but I'm going to foreshadow, because again, I don't want to go too long, is that one area where often community partners are very important is in that post-secondary preparation and post-secondary supports. And so many of those community partners, their work is based on having face-to-face connection with students in schools, right? And it's even not appropriate or allowed for them to have things like the kid's phone number or ways or email, right? So these organizations themselves, when schooling goes remote, become very disconnected themselves from schooling. So we have to think about ways that are appropriate and right, that we can re-engage them to make sure we have that additional person power. And there's some examples that have been listed here about how various places have repurposed folks that were doing one student support thing and help them become sort of COVID supports. and found good ways to do that. So that's just a reminder to sort of think about how we bring some of these resources back that got disconnected themselves. Next slide. And then, very important reminder, right, that students and their families' experience COVID may differ from those of most of the school staff. There are many sort of structural inequities, unfortunately, that remain in our nation that we must address. And we really have to connect then with a mindset of empathy and absence of blame, and really seeking to listen and understand where they're coming from before we make assumptions about why they're acting the way they are. Next slide. And that brings us to our Ohio resources.
All right, and I did mute you, Bob, just because that's where some feedback was coming from, so you're just warned ahead of time. All right, so the Ohio resources, if you notice here, a lot of these do not have the reset, restart before them, because they are things that we have had at the department prior to all of this happening. So the cultural competency resources, this is a link that we've provided. I believe it's actually connected to the state of Connecticut, but it is thorough and detailed on what cultural competency is and all these different resources relating to that. Then the community partnerships, that is a phenomenal document that details how to reach out to community partners and identifies the different kinds you can have, what resources they can provide. And in a time like now, people are really trying to help schools. And so look out to those community partners. They're probably more than willing. You just have to set up the ask. And then the evidence-based practice guide on climate and culture, really setting up that even though we're not within the brick and mortar for the most part, there still is a climate and culture piece to virtual learning. And so how do we take what we already have and just do a few tweaks to make it adaptable to the virtual world? And then those MTSS, that multi-tiered system of support, that's just a link to what Ohio has provided relating to that from years past. Nothing has changed, but it's still there and it's still applicable to what we are facing right now.
Thanks, Kimberly. So we are now at our Q&A time for supporting students, putting students at the center.
And we do have a question to kick us off.
Wonderful.
So there's been a push from national education leadership voices to stop focusing on all standards in a virtual format and shift focus to those power standards. Would you recommend that type of an approach of focusing which standards come first, or what would be your recommendation on which standards to focus on?
So I guess my answer to that is I do think the focus is important, because again, we know that from that America's Promise survey that virtually we end up spending a little less time in classrooms than we do in a regular format. And more, hopefully more independent time, but that's going to vary by kids' circumstances. And then I think of that school we highlighted that used the learning sciences, and their rule of thumb was, will this matter for the student 2 years from now? Right? If they're in 9th grade, will they need this when they're in 11th grade? If they're in 10th grade, will they need this when they're in 12th grade? As a way to sort of figure out what is most essential, as opposed to what is important, but push comes to shove in sort of extreme circumstances, it is something we can, we can focus on the thing that's sort of most essential. And so that may be officially the power standards, but I guess I would encourage us to use our own thought on that and not just assume that's the answer.
This might have been highlighted earlier when pointing to an ODE resource, but something I would think is very a good tool for especially ELA and math subject matter experts. We've posted in the student readiness toolkits 2 kind of gap analysis documents that have taken all of our Ohio learning standards for English language arts and math and put them into an Excel format so that teachers can go through and mark which standards were addressed prior to remote learning last year, which ones were delivered via remote learning, and which ones were maybe not delivered last year. kind of do an analysis of what may need recovered at the beginning of that grade that a student is progressing to following. So if you're interested, Kimberly provided the link to that in this presentation for those student readiness toolkits, but it seems like that would be a good tool to kind of start prioritizing which standards to focus on, especially at the beginning of the school year for those two subject areas. One of our callers reinforced the need for collaborative teacher teams to help identify these. So further driving home the point that organizing adults is essential. Yes,
and that collective intelligence, right, and collective insight, right, that it's hard to do anything alone, and especially in uncertain times. And so it's important to create time and space for those collaborative structures to be able to happen. All right, we're going to go now to a very short final lever, because I just know that we presented a lot of information today. We just wanted to be able to share what we learned with you. We appreciate your forbearance, and that it's really this is probably not a good example of how to do remote learning, but it's the one we could do in the time we have. We just wanted to make sure we got it to you, and probably just getting access to the PowerPoint and looking at it on your own after you've got a little bit of a introduction to it now is probably the most effective way to interact with it. So to round this off again is what do we know about keeping students on track to post-secondary success remotely during COVID? And here really I just want to make 2 points. And this is something that we may have an opportunity to return to with you later in the year. But if we go to the next slide, two things that for the 9th, 10th, and 11th graders, we really want to keep as much as we can. We understand there's real limits to this idea of giving them post-secondary and workforce preparation activities, experiences, and milestones, right? To give them both that exposure, those experiences, and making sure they're doing the things they need to do in each grade to be ready to make a really informed choice of their post-secondary pathway and have many options open. But what's so important about that now in this environment, beyond the particulars, is that this is hope, right? This is something to strive for. This is something for a better day, a better future. And it's so important when so many of our kids have experienced real loss and real stress and real hardships, as have our teachers, to have that shared hope and that shared sense that we're working for something together and we can do that and there is a path forward. And then the second group is our rising seniors, right? Because this is so unpredictable. We know we can't count on our normal cycles of saying, oh, we normally do that in February with our seniors, or we normally do that in January or November. We have to be honest. We don't know what November and January are going to bring, right? So we really have got to be thinking through as much, what can we fast forward? What can we get done as soon as we can get done to make sure they're on track for getting their applications in, for making an informed choice, for making sure their financial aid is in track. We really have to think about, that and some contingencies, right? If our normal processes, because we know a number of kids got caught in this, that they're really dependent on that daily contact with an adult to sort of nag and nurture them to get all the steps done, and that got knocked out, right? So how do we get ahead of that this year, and make sure that they're all can leave however our ups and downs of COVID are this year, that all our seniors will leave with a good place to go. And so just thinking how we can get ahead of that and build some contingencies while we have the time, I think is critical, along with that sense of hope for the other kids by keeping some of these activities going when and how we can. So with that, I believe there's probably some wonderful Ohio resources to go to, and then we'll have our final Q&A.
Thanks, Bob. And Cassie, feel free to chime in because I feel like this is totally your wheelhouse. So I hope I've done some justice to it. So as Bob said, this may not be a major focus of this year, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't lose focus of it. And within Ohio, there are wonderful resources with the industry recognized credentials And then they've also provided, and Cassie, you may be able to explain this document 10 times. I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but to give it the justice that it needs, this industry credential vendor flexibility information and guidance kind of outlines how do you work with certain vendors and industry people with the flexibility needed during these times.
So actually the real expert is on the line, and that's Graham Wood. He's been leading our industry recognized credential work at the department for a couple of years now. So I'd offer space for Graham to chime in. The other thing I'd mention is that many colleges are also offering opportunities for early college coursework amidst everything that's happening here. And for some students, especially those who are in their junior and senior year, taking a full online course load at the local community college or university might be the best fit for them and really help propel them to that post-secondary pathway success. But Graham, did you want to mention anything about industry recognized credentials and how those might be offered in a remote setting as schools are developing their remote learning plans?
Yeah, thanks, Cassie. Your advice is about as good as mine as it relates to offering credentials in a remote setting. I think that this is a question that a lot of folks have, but it's definitely a conversation that we're starting to have and trying to find people that have some great ideas about this. So if you know of anybody that is digging into this work and is having success or finding that that they're getting some good ideas together, please reach out to us here at the department, because we'd love to highlight that and share that work. But as much as possible, getting creative with how you're delivering credentials and trying to find ways to do this remotely or to find opportunities to, safely deliver credentials in person if it is a credential that really does need that in-person instruction, which is a lot of what folks see as it relates to industry credentials. It's really important to dig into that and to see that, because so much of what has been mentioned, we don't know what the world that these students are going to be walking out into will look like, and we're your guess is as good as ours as to when things will return back to normal and what normal will look like when we return there. So giving students as many tools in their tool belt that they can have when they walk out into my wife's a big Frozen fan, so I'm going to say into the unknown. That's huge, and credentials are an awesome tool to put into their tool belt that don't expire, that we already know that industry partners are looking for. So any opportunity that you have to dig into those is awesome and a great opportunity for those students. Thank you, Cassie.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I would just add just a little bit on is, we are trying to optimistically think of this as an opportunity to rethink or redesign or reframe school in some way, shape, or form. So the opportunity to put IT credential training in front of students in a remote environment makes a lot of sense. So if your school district or schools you work with haven't really considered offering students the opportunity to earn credentials, I would really encourage you to think about how to leverage this remote setting to think about IT. We know that the need for workers in information technology is just going to increase. So things like being able to program and being Cisco certified in one or more credentials could really be powerful for students in their post-secondary pathways. So thanks.
All right, and that brings us to our final Q&A, and we'll open this up to a global Q&A. Any questions or thoughts or comments on anything that we've gone over today? And as you're thinking about that, I just want to take a moment to thank everybody for the amazing work you're doing for your students and your families. Folks like us can help, the state's helping, districts are helping, but end of the day, it's that school teachers and school leaders who are the ones that have to make it happen. And it's incredibly challenging work and incredibly challenging times. And just from working with the high schools that we work with in Ohio, and it's amazing work that the folks are doing at the school level. And I just want to take a moment to thank you for that incredibly important work you're doing. And with that, open to any and all questions and comments on taking the learnings of cross-state high schools and to inform remote learning plans.
And at this point, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your questions too, right, to our Johns Hopkins team. So we have the opportunity to interact in this way this time. So we'd love for you to have a chance to ask your question personally.
Or by chat. Chat's good too.
As you're processing and maybe thinking through some of your questions, we would love to know if you found any of this information helpful. So any comment via chat you'd like to make, or if you need or want a walkthrough of some of the individual levers and evidence-based practices that fall within them, our teams are more than welcome or willing to share that information with you and your team. So please reach out to us if you would like more information on this work. We will be, moving into a collaborative for next year as well. So be on the lookout for more information. So we got a question about how will we be provided access to the recording of this session, and very well done and informative. Thank you. So kudos to our Everyone Graduates Center team. We are going to post the link to this recorded session on our high school redesign collaborative webpage on the Ohio Department of Education's webpage. So in the same way that we made an announcement about this opportunity, we will also make an announcement about the recorded session being available. So take a, check out Ed Connection and check your emails for those type of announcements, but it will be posted on the high school redesign collaborative webpage on the Ohio Department of Education.
And Cassie, also that will enable them to click the links to the various references we gave them within the PowerPoint.
Yep. So we shared earlier on in a chat the web version for folks to be able to go in and do that right now.
Okay, great.
And then we'll post this recorded session on the high school redesign collaborative webpage after we get the recording processed and things. But we'll also put another link to the presentation right there with the recording too.
Because many of those links we put in there will be some of the most useful tools you can find, because those links take you to actual tools to do the idea that was shared.
Perfect. Yep, so folks can get that right now via the link we shared, and then they'll be able to view the recording probably next week sometime. And we're getting kudos, Bob, so thank you very much. Two folks mentioned how well done it was. Another folk mentioned that. Yep. And thank you for sharing about the work. Really appreciate the focus on the preconditions for accurate measure of learning loss. Also, the thoughts about expanding and adapting MTSS teams and processes to support that work. So folks have really taken away a lot from your message, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like that might be all we're getting right now, Bob.
Sounds good. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share what we've been learning. And again, we thank you for the work you do. And as we said, if you have questions and follow-ups, please feel free to ask.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Special thanks to our Everyone Graduates Center partners and our ODE friends that are on the line as well. Thank you for attending this afternoon, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Everyone take care.
Bye-bye. Be well.